The example I'm going to go through is in PsychoPy. So to give a little bit of context, here you can see I have our Quarto slides. You'll start to notice these crop up, especially going into tomorrow. What this means is I have made my PowerPoints for a lot of these sessions using R, because I go back and forth between PowerPointing and R code quite frequently, and this makes it easier. So this, if you haven't seen this before, it might seem sort of strange, but if you want to open the slides, you need to double click on the .html, and that'll get you the slides of what I'm about to present. And if you want to look at the sample experiment I will be talking about, there are multiple here. If you want to, you can open, as long as you have some sort of code viewer app on your computer. It doesn't have to be PsychoPy, actually. You should be able to open this .py file and follow along. You don't have to. I'll show you the important chunks of code so you can come back later and find them. We will also be using PsychoPy Builder for a small chunk of this next section. And if you wanted to, you could open, if you have PsychoPy installed on your computer, you could open the PsychoPy Builder as well. So just to sort of orient you, if you want to have things open on your own computer while I am going through slides, you are welcome to do that, of course. And now, actually, one moment. I have to change my screen setup real quick. Okay, great. So I was just turning on screen mirroring. Alrighty, so for this session, my closed captionings are gone. Okay, we'll leave that for now. Hopefully people on Zoom can still access them. Okay, my goal in this workshop is to give you everything you need to quickly get started, to cut out a lot of these sort of steps where we are just trying to figure out, we have 5 options and we start down one path and then realize it wasn't the right option, and then we have to back up and go do the next thing. So to give you these samples so you can decide with like the best knowledge, should I use Experiment Builder or PsychoPy? I'm showing you the PsychoPy example experiment, and I'm going to try and do my best to make this as user-friendly as possible. So even if you are not super familiar with PsychoPy, hopefully you will be able to pick this up. There are lots of amazing videos on the internet that show you how to build things in PsychoPy in what's called PsychoPy Builder, which is a visual GUI. And so I'll show you how we can use the visual GUI, which there are lots of tutorials for, to generate code. Because the eye tracking sample experiment is a .py file, which means it's Python code, which I know can be sort of scary, but there are some major benefits of incorporating PsychoPy with the EyeLink system. So the pros here are that it is extremely flexible. Anything you can imagine, you can create. Any experiment you can code with Python or PsychoPy, you can do with the eye tracker. It's highly reproducible because it's free, it's open source. So you can easily share your experiment materials, whereas what we were discussing with Experiment Builder, you have to have this plugin to even open and edit a file. And so because it's proprietary, it is, sort of restricted by SR research. What are some of the cons, though, of this method and reasons you might want to do Experiment Builder, like Daphne was showing us? It is going to require some amount of coding know-how. I'm going to try and distill it down to the very basics so that you can sort of take code chunks and put them where you need to put them without becoming a master coder. But you do need to have a bit of an idea of how code works. And so that can be a little bit of a barrier to entry. I'm going to do my best to remove that barrier to entry, but I just wanted to acknowledge that that is the con of this method. Oh, and the other being there is less support from SR research if you are not using their proprietary software. There's a lot of online support for PsychoPy issues broadly, lots of forums and things, but because PsychoPy is free, there isn't someone who is paid to help you solve your problem. All right, so there are two sample experiments in this practical example 2 folder. One of them I have called bare bones. It is like the simplest example experiment I could think of. What participants do in this experiment is they listen to one sentence each trial, and then they are prompted to repeat what they heard aloud. What they're seeing on screen is a circle while they hear a sentence. Then they sit in silence for a little bit, and then it changes to a fixation cross. And they're told before they start the experiment, the fixation cross means it's time to repeat aloud. So as you can imagine, there's no text. It's very, very, very minimal, which can be a nice sort of starting example, but a lot of the times we want to do more complex things than that. So what we're going to talk about is taking this sort of sample experiment and adding the complexity that you need for your experimental needs. And the only response that's collected, I mean, the eye tracker is collecting data during this time, but the only response in this task is a keyboard button to move to the next trial. I also have another example experiment, which is still pretty simple, but it's a little more complicated, and it's one that we are actually actively using here at BCBL in the lab, where participants, again, they're listening to sentences, and then they type what they heard into a response box. There's a very nice response box feature in PsychoPy that is very easy to implement, much easier than experiment builders, I will say. And then they actually move to the next trial by clicking a button on screen. So this is a mouse click response within this area. And so that uses the button feature within PsychoPy. So a couple slightly more complicated features being introduced here. Still a very simple sample experiment that you can essentially take out what you don't need, throw it away, put in what you're going to need. So that's the direction we're going. Within the folder, there are also copies with each sample experiment of what I call walkthroughs. These are Word documents where I went through my final sample experiment that's been shared with you, and I go through and I describe line by line where critical chunks of code are. So it's meant to be just a guide. If you start to edit the experiment, the lines of code will no longer match up, but it should still be a helpful guide to you, especially when you're getting started. There's also some things I note here, like at BCBL, we have this weird thing that maybe is only a BCBL thing where we have to open up the Python command line app and type import PyLink before we run these experiments. And we have not found a workaround other than doing this. And that in other universities is probably not an issue. So one little quirk, but I'll take it because it gives us lots of flexibility when we use PsychoPy. So we're going to start looking at this experiment, and I don't want anyone to panic when they see that there is endless lines of code. A lot of this, if you're looking at this PowerPoint, a lot of these are scrollable, just so you know. Anywhere there's code chunks, because of the way I built this PowerPoint, you can actually usually scroll. So I don't expect everyone here to become an expert Python coder, or in this case, PsychoPy coder, which is Python, but using a lot of functions that PsychoPy is sort of, you know, the hub for. There are just key sections of this experiment that you will need to know how to identify and edit and adapt to your needs. And that's what we're going to focus on today, is identifying the critical areas that you would need to edit. We will not be writing code from scratch. I'm very proficient with PsychoPy Coder. I don't write my code from scratch. I use PsychoPy Builder, and I'll show you this in a moment. And I make visually my experiment I want, and then you can click and convert it to code, and it writes the code for you. And it's beautiful and it's magical. And that's the strategy we're going to use because it's efficient. So this is what it looks like if you open up the builder base, is what I call this. So this is essentially, I knew I wanted to make my listen and then type what you heard task. And so like I said, in the builder view of PsychoPy, I created this experiment, and I call it builder base because we're just using it to generate code that we're going to steal and put it in our script. And the reason, just to clarify, that we are using the coder view is because talking to the eye tracker is complicated. And so that required being in coder view. I really wanted to find a way around that, but I couldn't. So essentially, all of the complicated stuff of how it talks to the eye tracker, you will never edit. You just are going to plop in key code chunks that you need in order to make the sample experiment do what you want it to do instead. So if you open up Builder Base, what you will see is that there are two routines. It's a very simple experiment. I didn't even finish building it. I didn't put in all of the stimuli. It was just enough to make the components sort of link together like you would with a real experiment. Routine number 1 is called trial audio. And what we can see is there is a fixation cross. So this is a text feature. And this is literally just a plus sign in the middle of the screen. And it's on screen from 0 to 11 seconds. Trial audio starts 5 seconds in. That's because I want them to be sitting in silence for 5 seconds for that nice long baseline period. Then they will hear a sentence. The sentences actually vary in length, but I have allotted 3 seconds here because none of them go over 3 seconds. And then you can see the sentence after it ends, there's still a fixation cross. This is essentially how I have it make them sit in silence and wait for a bit before they start their response period. Then the response period is a different routine. So if you were to click on that, you would see a different tab pop up. This has 2 features, and this is where I mean you can add so much complexity. You can do whatever you need to do. I've been working with a master's student named Jimena who had an experiment where there were like 4 buttons on screen and really like complicated things, and we built the base of it with PsychoPy, and it was very easy because they have things like this button feature that you can just plop in. And I'm not showing you the details here, but essentially it says enviar because this is in Spanish. And as soon as the participant clicks on it, it ends the routine. And so that's essentially the submit button to move on. There's a text box feature, which you just plop in there, and it just, anything that gets typed appears on the screen. And PsychoPy has done a very nice job with both of these features. They are very nice. Once we have made our routines, this is a fully functioning experiment. You can see there's actually a trial loop even. All you have to do is click compiled Python script. It's this button up here. And once you do that, in your directory, which I was showing you earlier, underneath .psyexperiment, what will appear is a .py file. This is the code that it has generated for you. So if you make your own version and you don't call it builder base, maybe you call it reading words version 2, that's the name of your .psi experiment. When you generated it, it'll say reading words version 2 .py. If you then open up this py file, you can do this with PsychoPy Coder is my preferred for editing. We will then be able to go into this code and steal key code chunks. Don't get scared. I know it's a lot of code, but I'm going to tell you the keywords that you can just do with search, like the control find function. And this will, you can come back to this PowerPoint and you can remind yourself of the key things to search for within your really customized experiment, and it'll guide you to the key sections. So what I've done here is I've highlighted, just for this slide, you can see this is the same code, but if you were to search and initialize components, it would jump you down to this. What's here? Well, my experiment has an audio file. This is all of the setup that PsychoPy generated for me for playing that audio file. I had a fixation cross. This is a visual text stimulus. So we can see there's a lot of very code languagey stuff, but it should be everything that you told the visual graphic user interface to do. It will automatically write it into code for you. It separates your routines. So as I noted, I had 2 routines, a trial audio routine and a response routine. And so the 2 routines will have their components separately. You're going to want to copy all components you use in your task, and you're going to put those into your experiment. The other thing you're going to need to search for is the code where these routines are actually running. So if you search for prepare to start routine, it'll jump you down to another section. And within this section, this is like the standard way all PsychoPy experiments are written. So this is just jumping between, we have 2 routines. And so we can see they're separated here. There's a whole bunch of code here, and some of it you will see already exists in the sample experiment, so you don't actually need to edit it. The key lines I will point you to is if you have added more components, your unique component names need to go here. That's really critical. And then you'll see that this is the actual section where we are running this routine, and just huge chunks of this code we're going to copy and plop into the sample experiment. And so we would do that for the two different routines. The way PsychoPy does this in the code is it'll do one entire routine, and then it's within what's called a while loop. And then it'll move on to the entire next routine. So depending on how many routines you make in order to make your experimental procedure, you might have more of these sections than the sample experiment does. Okay, let's talk about where you put these stolen chunks of code. You should go back to the example experiment. The typed responses one is the one that I'm working off of here as an example. You will need to search experiment-specific settings and variables. This is a comment I have put in to guide you to where you should plop in your initialized components. So for example, here is my text box. Here is my submit button. Here is my trial audio. Okay, so I have taken my critical setup code chunks and I have plopped them in. A couple of important notes. The sample experiments for PsychoPy and EyeLink are set up in pixels, whereas PsychoPy, the builder view, the graphic user interface, will default to like proportional. It's like 0 to 1. So if you want your thing to be in the center of the screen, it's like 0.5. It will want you to do things in pixels. So for example, my text box, the letter height is now in pixels, and I had to edit that manually. And this is something that actually gave me trouble when I first started, because I had copied this code over and the text was so small I couldn't see it. And I thought it wasn't working, but it was actually just 0.5 in pixels is invisible, essentially. So that's one important thing. The setup for talking to the EyeLink system, it is better to be in pixels. So you will have to, the only thing you need to edit in these code chunks is changing anything that is in the sort of PsychoPy units, which is usually 0 to 1, changing it to pixels. I also have some notes somewhere, maybe in tomorrow's section, of when I've done this at BCBL, our monitors are like 1720 by this, and you will know the exact pixel dimensions of the monitor here at BCBL. And it's pretty standard across eye trackers if you're not at BCBL. Okay, the other thing you'll be stealing is that trial procedure. So the next thing you should search for is function containing trial procedure, which I have put a comment here to guide you to. This is where your routines are going to go. This is a fairly custom section, I will admit, because it's written more in the Python style than the PsychoPy style. My apologies, but it's very efficient. So we are defining a function where we are inputting our variables, and then essentially you'll see in the sample experiment there is a Excel file with the list, just like you do with pretty much any experiment software, where you list all of the trials, the exact stimulus you want to play, and what condition label is assigned to that. This is just for my sample experiment. It's saying, look at the Excel file and the current row, which is your current trial. Grab the condition, grab the sentence, grab the audio, grab these features, like I wanted to know what accent and what speaker. This will always need customized, depending on what sort of attributes you're keeping track of in your experiment. So this is an area that will need customized, but there is instructions in the Word document in detail explaining how this works. I sort of skipped over it, but you would paste in your routines. You can see, hopefully this is sort of ringing a bell, the components here, start procedure, all of this, you'll see the code matches between the sample and the code you generated. I promise you it is pretty much the same. You can select what exists and delete it and put in yours, and it should work. The last thing, and this came up in the last session too, messages are like super important. When I process my data, and so the scripts you'll get tomorrow for processing data, I get all of the information about my data from the EDF file. This is EyeLink's file format. It stands for like EyeLink data file. I put all of these messages in with everything about, so I have my condition, what sentence I played, all of the attributes of my trial I send, as well as the typed response gets sent to this file as well. These sorts of things also a standard for PsychoPy, they will get saved to like a CSV for you. The reason I like to send them to the EDF is because then you don't need to open two different kinds of files and merge them together. All of the data that we use will come straight from the EDF. And that is the only thing I use when I process my data. I actually don't even open the CSV files that PsychoPy generates. Okay, the last thing I need to talk about, and this is detailed quite a bit in the Word documents, and so I know reading a Word document sounds really boring, but I am going to refer you to that a little bit. The one thing I wanted to clarify is if you look at this sample experiment, it's really long, I know, but all the way at the bottom is this critical section, which is called Step 7, Randomize and Run Experiment Trials. Essentially, the way this experiment is set up is you make your big experiment, you make the run trial function, and then down here, we can completely control randomization. And this is where it's different than what PsychoPy would generate, but it is very nice. It's more Python coding here. And the Word document does give you details on how you can customize this. So for example, what is happening here is first I am opening two CSV files. One of them I'm calling practice and one of them is called my trial list. It opens these files using the pandas package. It then does some very custom randomization. So this is currently the typed response example. If this is too complex for you, if all you want to do is randomize order, then look at the bare bones experiment because it's much simpler. It just randomizes the order of trials. It doesn't do anything too complicated. Here I'm using Python to essentially, I'm opening 3 different files, which are different speakers, and I'm randomizing them, like the order of the sentences, but I'm having certain speakers go after each other because that was the design of this experiment. You can customize anything you want for randomization here within your code. And so you don't need to, for example, generate a bunch of Excel files in advance that will have the randomization for your subjects. But like I said, look at the bare bones experiment if you want the simpler version, which just takes your list of trials, shuffles it, and then gives it to your participant. It will then save a CSV file so that you do have a copy of all of your trials, just in case something goes wrong with your messages within the EDF file. You do have a backup of this randomized order for this specific participant. And then it starts the actual like meat and potatoes. It's actually going to start running the task on these lines. And so here I show a message on screen. So up above, if you wanted to edit the message function, you would see welcome. And I have some text up there that it's pulling right now. It's going to show this on screen and wait for a key press. And then it'll start my practice trials. There are 3 practice trials. And so it's running those. Then I have it set to show another experiment screen. Then it does my first 30 trials. Then it does a break, and so on and so forth. If you, for example, what this allows you to do is if you have the same exact experiment that is 60 trials, and the last person who ran this experiment, they only did a break halfway. But for whatever reason, you really want breaks every quarter of the way through the experiment. It is exceptionally easy to alter this and go between your randomization and your breaks, and much easier than the PsychoPy generated code would have you do it, in my opinion. So apologies that this is very Python-y. Look at the Word document and it'll hopefully help you. But I assure you, this is like a very clean way and it gives you complete control over your experiment. And so I will leave you with that. There is even more you can customize that I detail in that document. And be brave. I know it's a lot, but I think there are huge benefits over Experiment Builder. Depending on what you're doing, it might be the only option. You know, essentially, you might start with Experiment Builder and discover you need to do something so complex that you can't really do it. I don't have a solid example of that. But if that's the case, I just want you to know that this is a resource that is also available to you. And I can guarantee anything you can dream, you can do because it's code. So, okay, let's break for lunch. And Marco, do we want to come back at